Hi, I'm Ivo Daalder. I used to be the U.S. Ambassador to Nato. I am now a senior fellow at Harvard's Belfer Center. And I'm very pleased to be here in Steamboat to be part of the Steamboat seminars and talk about what's happening after Pax Americana has died. So that'll be my lecture today. I'm glad to be here and hope you'll enjoy it.
And welcome to the 23rd season of seminars at Steamboat. I'm Mitch Wallerstein. I'm the chair of the board of seminars, and I have the honor of succeeding Walt Dabbert in this role. And I'd like to begin by publicly thanking him for his hard work and leadership during his tenure as chair. He has handed off a strong and successful organization, and I will do my best to build on his many accomplishments. This evening is the first of 5 nonpartisan public policy presentations on topics that range from the future role of the United States in international affairs, which we'll be talking about tonight, to the role of the university in a democratic society, and the constitutional underpinnings of democracy. The seminars board has worked hard since last summer to put together an eclectic mix of talks for this summer's series. Talks that are both timely and relevant to the current public policy issues of the day. Our lineup of expert speakers brings fresh and varied perspectives, and your presence here reflects your commitment to stay informed and engaged in this critical discourse. As has become our tradition, there will be an audience Q&A with the speaker immediately following this evening's presentation. You can submit questions at any time during the talk using your smartphone, either by going on the Strings Wi-Fi, and I think the information, well, not there, but the next slide. There is information on how to access the Wi-Fi, and then you open the app pigeonhole.at on your browser and enter the code 80487. You can also scan the QR code shown on the screen and on the back of your program to access the app. On behalf of the Board of Directors of Seminars at Steamboat, I want to express our sincere thanks and appreciation to all of the sponsors and other donors who make this series possible. Your support enables us to bring these impactful presentations to the Steamboat community free of any admission charge. We especially want to recognize and thank tonight's seminar sponsor, the City of Steamboat Springs, as well as our supporting sponsors, Susan Larson and Holly and Gary Nelson. Let's give them a round of applause. Donations to help keep seminars free are most welcome, and they are very much needed. You can donate by going to our website, and you can also now use Venmo. QR codes for both methods are also printed on the back of your program. Video recordings of all seminars are available by going to the seminar's website, and they're also posted on YouTube. We now also are using closed captioning in both English and Spanish. We encourage you to share the link to these recordings with your friends and colleagues, both here in the Yampa Valley and beyond, so we can spread the word about seminars. Podcasts of all seminars are made available after each event on our local public radio station here in Northern Colorado, KUNC. And you can link to the podcasts and also the videos by going to shows and podcasts on KUNC website, which is, not surprisingly, kunc.org. With those housekeeping matters out of the way, let me now welcome to the stage Bob Stein. Bob is one of the founders of Seminars at Steamboat, and he is a former board chair himself. He will introduce this evening's speaker and serve as the moderator for the Q&A session that will follow. Bob, the floor is yours.
Welcome to the first seminar of 2025. It really is my honor to welcome Ambassador Ivo Daalder to Steamboat. We went out on a lovely walk this morning, saw the flowers. I'm not going to repeat his bio, it's in the program. just mention a couple of things. He served as the U.S. ambassador to NATO, and until this month was the president of the Chicago Council on Global Affairs. He's the author of many books, and I personally recommend this one, The Empty Throne, America's Abdication of Global Leadership. Off the Beaten Path has copies for sale in the rear, and Ambassador Daalder will autograph copies after the seminar. The subject of After Pax America What is something we've all been thinking about, given the changes wrought by the current administration in pulling back from international organizations and agreements. In The Empty Throne, he wrote, and I quote, "If you're not at the table, you're on the menu." We are counting on Ambassador Daalder to, and please forgive the pun, help us digest that statement. How will it play out? Please give a big Steamboat welcome to Ambassador Ivo Daalder. We'll see you later.
For that kind introduction. Digestion is less these days. I'm more into alcohol. And after this talk and the conversation we're going to have, you will be more into alcohol as well. So the Pax Americana was born on December 7, 1941, and it died not necessarily prematurely, but definitely dead, on January 20th, 2025. So that raises a question, in fact, three questions that I want to discuss with you tonight. One is, what was the Pax Americana? Why did it die? And finally, what comes after it? So let's start on the Pax Americana. Not everyone may remember exactly where it came from and what it meant, but it was born, as I said, on December 7, 1941, also known as the day that Japan attacked the United States Navy in Pearl Harbor. For years prior to that, Americans had been debating the wisdom of whether or not to enter this war or even to support one side over another. America Firsters, as they were known, were debating American Engagers. But it took the surprise attack that sank half the U.S. Navy, to decide the matter once and for all. Because immediately after that attack, a day that will live in infamy, as President Roosevelt said, the United States entered World War II. But Roosevelt had always known that the United States could only be on one side on this war, and that was the side of the Allies fighting the Axis powers. What he also understood early on was that for America's full economic and military might while it had entered the war, he was determined to use that moment to change America's and indeed to change the world's destiny. Well before the war had ended, he considered how the world could be remade, not only to end the scourge of war, but to deliver peace, the prosperity, and the freedom that Americans and so many others around the world both desired and deserved. He believed that America's destiny lay in building institutions that would facilitate America's permanent engagement in the world, something that up to that moment, the United States, with small exceptions, had not done. But he believed it was essential, that in order for us to be secure, in order for us to be prosperous, in order for us to be truly free, we had to be engaged in the world. And so he championed a United Nations with a charter that would set forth the basic rules of how we would interact with each other. Bretton Woods international and financial and economic institutions that promoted prosperity through the free exchange of goods, capital, and people. And even although written by his wife, a universal declaration of human rights that would enshrine the ideals that individuals are all born free in dignity and possessing equal rights. Now, that innovation of how to think about the world and its implementation not only by Roosevelt and those who served in his administration, but by Truman and those who served in his administration after Roosevelt passed in 1944, was a vision that frankly never came truly, was never truly fulfilled, because even though the United States entered the post-war period firmly believing that this is how the world should be organized, the United States, and indeed the Pax Americana, this American created and maintained peace, confronted a competing ideology that was being pushed by one of the Allied powers, in this case the Soviet Union, pushing a universalist ideology that stood in direct opposition to the very ideas and ideals of America's own vision of global order. And so the United Nations, in fact, was unable to guarantee collective security because of the split between the West and the East, between the United States and the Soviet Union, which therefore led to the creation of alliances as alternative means for collective security. Alliances that were based on the idea that a permanent American military presence on the soil of allies would prevent war rather than having to fight them. America often engaged in military action to counter a perceived and real Soviet influence, and sometimes, as in Vietnam, for example, it did so in ways that had disastrous results. It turned out also that the cost of undergirding this Pax Americana, this global economy, through the gold standard became too high to bear. In the 1970s, we left the gold standard, though the US dollar and US Treasury still remain the world's reserve currency and investment and safe haven. And the ideals of the Declaration of Human Rights were often used more as a stick by the United States to berate others than as a standard to judge our own behavior. But nevertheless, after 40 years, the Soviet Union lost the competition in a way that was a victory for the very ideas that Roosevelt had started out with. Its collapse in 1991 freed people in Central and Eastern Europe, and indeed people in the 15 former Soviet and now independent republics, that allowed them to seek their own identity. And this is where the story becomes critically important, because it's here where we start the beginning of a decline that ultimately leads to the death of the Pax Americana. And let me explain why. America, in some ways, emerged out of the Cold War as the undisputed sole superpower, indeed a hyperpower, as the French would call it, having vanquished the Soviet Union, ended Europe's division once and for all, marshaled a large multinational coalition to oust Saddam Hussein from Kuwait, and led the largest peacetime expansion of the US and global economy since the end of World War II. America was indeed unassailable. It was a true superpower, the sole superpower. Yet far from using the power that the United States had in 1989 and the early 90s to renew the Pax Americana for a new age, as America's post-World War II predecessors had done so successfully, successive post-Cold War presidents and administrations squandered the advantage that America enjoyed. Indeed, within a quarter century, America was little more than first among equals in a world that had seen a rising China, a resurgent Russia, an increasingly independent Europe, all of whom were competing for power and influence with the United States. Now, some of this change, of course, was inevitable. Countervailing power was likely to reemerge to the dominance of the United States, but it happened far more rapidly, I would argue, because of the way the United States decided to use, and importantly, not use, the power it had. Most importantly, Unlike post-war American leaders 80 years earlier, Washington failed, singularly failed, from the 1990s and the 2000s onwards to shape the international environment to its own advantage while it possessed the power to do so. The squandering was bipartisan. It occurred across all administrations. And while America enjoyed its share of foreign policy successes in the last 35 years, its failures are the ones that stand out. Worst of all, those failures ushered in the demise of the Pax Americana itself. So what went wrong? One part of the problem was a conceptual issue. The second was a execution failure on the policy. The conceptual failure lay in the belief that because America had triumphed in the Cold War, the ideas it had long propounded were now universally embraced, that everybody would agree with us. The victory, indeed, of America's ideals of freedom, democracy, and free markets, many believed represented the final stage in humankind's historical development, the end of history, as Frank Fukuyama so extraordinarily presciently called it. The entire world, was the belief, including Russia and China, would soon converge with the West and embrace these ideals as their own, recognize that economic and political openness was the best, not only the best, the only way to meet the needs and the desires of their people. And because America's power was now unassailable, America had this opportunity to hasten history along. Economic integration and openness would lead to political liberalization in countries like Russia and China, and military intervention could hasten the day that freedom and democracy could be embraced in countries that had neither. The three principal conceptual architects of this new era were Frank Fukuyama, who I mentioned, but also Tom Friedman, the columnist and writer for the New York Times, and Charles Krauthammer, the late Charles Krauthammer, a brilliant conservative analyst. Their influential articles and books, The End of History, The World is Flat by Tom Friedman, and The Unipolar Moment, captured in some ways the zeitgeist of the time and provided the blueprint for policymakers in the Clinton administration and subsequent administrations to pursue. Now, to be fair to Krauthammer, Friedman, and Fukuyama, the arguments were far more nuanced than the popular interpretation has given them credit for. I don't think that anybody ever actually read past page 350 of The World is Flat to discover that Friedman saw all kinds of speed bumps that could potentially derail his utopian vision, or that Frank Fukuyama put a question mark behind the title, The End of History. But be that as it may, the popular interpretation was widely accepted. America in 1990, 1991, 1992 was all-powerful. Globalization, economic globalization, would integrate the world and liberalize the countries that were run by autocrats, and democracy would be on the march everywhere. The purpose of policy was to preserve America's primacy, to advance globalization, and to defend and also to promote democracy around the world. That was the world that we had entered into after the Cold War. The problem was that we were wrong conceptually, and we were wrong in our execution. In conceptual terms, we were wrong to think that history had ended, that somehow our ideas could not be challenged, that there might be not other people who said, you know, I'm not really certain that the way you organize your societies is the best way to organize your societies. It also turned out the case that economic liberalization, openness to the world, might not necessarily lead to political liberalization. In fact, it might do the opposite. It may make you more repressive, more autocratic. And indeed, democracy, as we now know, was hardly on the march. Soon after the end of the Cold War, democracy was in retreat. But if you reread some of the speeches and some of the arguments that were being made at the time, you remind how strong the sentiment was that they were right. Take Bill Clinton's arguments on globalization. They're remarkable when you think about them now. Remember that in 1998 and 1999, Bill Clinton spent an incredible amount of time and effort to get most favored nation status for China, and ultimately to bring China into the World Trading Organization. And he thought, in his probably most famous speech, that bringing China into the WTO was, as he called, a no-brainer. This agreement is the equivalent of a one-way street. He described economic openness almost as if it were a virus that would attack the autocratic system and generate political openness as a means. He was a techno-optimist, given what we know today. He said, in the new century, liberty will be spread by cell phone and cable modem. Now, there's no question that China has been trying to crack down on the internet. Good luck, he said. That's like trying to nail Jell-O to a wall. Well, in 2025, it doesn't quite look that way anymore. Or take my other favorite post-war Cold War president, George W. Bush. Less than 2 months after the invasion of Iraq, Bush landed on the Abraham Lincoln aircraft carrier in a flight suit with the big sign, mission accomplished. And he said, in the battle of Iraq, the United States and our allies have prevailed. And now our coalition is engaged in securing and reconstructing the country. He spoke to the U.S. military. He said, because of you, our nation is more secure, and because of you, the tyrant has fallen. The road ahead might be long, but the destiny was clear, and I quote, the transition from dictatorship to democracy will take time, but it is worth every effort. Our coalition will stay until our work is done. Then we will leave, and we will leave behind a free Iraq. I don't know how many of you have been to Iraq lately. I think that makes the point. It's not particularly free. Bush also was a techno-optimist. He believed that the military could be used to change things almost for free. He said, in the image of these falling statutes, we have witnessed the arrival of a new era. For hundreds of years, culminating in the nuclear age, military technology was designed and deployed to inflict casualties on an ever-growing scale. But today, military power was used to end a regime by breaking a nation. Today, we have greater power to free a nation by breaking a dangerous, aggressive regime. New tactics, new precision weapons can achieve military objectives without direct violence against civilians. I don't know if you've been watching TV and seen what's happening in Gaza or in Kyiv and Ukraine, but the idea that military technology can change regimes without killing people is a kind of optimism that is remarkable. Now, the election of Barack Obama signaled a retreat from what I would call the hubris that had emerged after the post-Cold War period, and a more restrained foreign policy was being introduced. But frankly, I would argue, and I served in the administration, so I can argue that it was no more successful than the policies of his predecessors. Of course, Obama campaigned on ending the Iraq War, and once in office, he moved to pull U.S. troops out of the country, which left a vacuum that was rapidly filled by ISIS, and would later mean that we had to go back. While he endorsed a surge into Afghanistan, he limited both the extent of the surge and the longevity of the America's renewed military commitment, and it turned out he was as eager to get out as he had been to get in. And faced with turmoil in the Arab world, he hesitated to pull the full weight of America's power behind the people demanding an Arab Spring, with the predictable result that despots were able to cement their hold on power. The one exception in Libya, one I participated in as the U.S. ambassador to NATO, was executed in a way that was bound to fail. In the case of Syria, we also had an ends-means problem where we had great ends. Assad needs to go, we need to draw red lines, and then fell by the wayside in not implementing it when the need arose. When Russia seized Crimea and invaded eastern Ukraine, remember this happened in 2014, Obama's first response was, we won't send American troops, and he decided to impose sanctions instead. He even refused to provide Ukraine with lethal defensive weapons, javelins, anti-tank weapons, to help an overrun army hold steady. On China, Obama chose to believe Xi Jinping's promise not to militarize the artificial islands it was creating in the South China Sea or to stop stealing our commercial technology, but then did nothing when Xi predictably broke his promise. Now, Donald Trump's election, and I know you were waiting for this, but I think it's important to set it up. Donald Trump's election in 2016 should have been a warning call to all of us that things were not right. He rode to power a wave of discontent and dissolution in our country. A discontent that resulted, in my view, directly from the failures of successive American administrations to salvage the Pax Americana and to build it for a new era. Far from liberalizing Russia and China, as I mentioned, became more compressive and more controlling of their economies, and China used the time to get not only rich and powerful, but to think through strategically how it could challenge the United States. As a result of globalization, we not only had more trade, but also more inequality. We also had cheaper goods, but also less industrialization. And we had a movement of people for a whole variety of reasons, economic and otherwise, that led to large-scale immigration, not only in the United States, but throughout Europe, creating a backlash that ultimately allowed populist and illiberal leaders to exploit for their own purposes. And U.S. power had eroded as well because of its hubristic interventions, particularly in Iraq, but also in the way it intervened in Afghanistan, the financial crisis of 2008 and 2009, and these false assumptions about what Russia and China would do. And it was that discontent that resulted from these failures that Donald Trump, as shrewd a salesman as there has ever been in American politics, was able to ride to power. But Trump not only reflected the growing discontent, he went a step further. He, as the only president since FDR, rejected the foundational principles of America's role in the world. He believed allies, our friends, took advantage of us. He believed that open markets meant that people were stealing our jobs and our money. And while he understood that freedom and democracy might be nice, he frankly did not think it should be top of mind. Now, in his first term, and this is the book that Jim Lindsay and I wrote about, he tried to act on these ideas, but he frankly failed. He failed for two reasons. First, he didn't understand how government worked. One of the hardest things in Washington, even by those who have spent time in government, is to learn how to get things done. In fact, I know people who've been in government for 50 years and have no idea how to get things done. Trump thought he could run the government like he ran his own business, but you can't, no matter how much you try. Second, because he didn't know how to get things done in government, he appointed people of stature and experience, maybe not the right stature and the right experience, but those people were critical to being in his cabinet. People like the CEO of ExxonMobil, people like the president of Goldman Sachs, people like a former Marine commandant and the head of Southcom. All of them had this in common. they still believed in the foundational powers, the foundational principles of Pax Americana. And more importantly, they knew perhaps not how to get things done. They certainly knew how to prevent Trump from getting his way. He left Washington disappointed in his ability to remake America and determined to return and try again. And he has. He won in 2024 with more votes than any other person ever received in a presidential election, with the exception of Joe Biden 4 years earlier. And this time he's back and he's determined to succeed. Don't take it from me, take it from him. Trump told The Atlantic a couple of months ago in a remarkable interview, which if you haven't read, you have to read. He said, the first time I had two things to do, run the country and survive. I had all these crooked guys trying to stop me. But the second time, I run the country and the world. Indeed, Trump has done more, I would argue, in 6 months to reorder America and the world than any other president in history. Most importantly, he has been steadily unmaking the world America made. He called into question America's long-standing security alliances, not least by siding with Russia twice at the UN against Ukraine and Europe, and by conditioning America's defense commitments on how much others were willing to spend. He has upended a global trading system through universal tariffs, and he started with trade wars not just with his foes, but frankly with America's friends. He has exercised executive power at the expense both of Congress and the courts, which, last time I read the Constitution, are two co-equal branches of government. And he has undermined American power in myriad and novel ways by ending federal funding of research universities that have been the foundation of America's global innovation and scientific success over the past 80 years. He ended core development and other assistance to the rest of the world that had been the foundation of our soft power around the world for decades. And by ending support for democracy and human rights, eliminating staffing, whole bureaus in the State Department, USAID, and programs like the Voice of America and Radio Free Europe and Radio Free Asia, supporting undermining UN agencies and embracing strongland like El Salvador's leader Bukele, and making his first foreign trip to those close democratic friends, Saudi Arabia, the United Arab Emirates, and Qatar. But aside from his specific actions, and we will talk more about that, I am sure, Trump has done, in a few short months, something more fundamental. He has undermined the core ingredient of America's power, of America's role. And that ingredient is trust. We came out of World War II because in a way that people trusted American power. I was born and raised in the Netherlands, and my father was liberated by the American Army in Northern Holland, and my mother was able to return after she had fled to Switzerland in 1942 to escape the Holocaust because of American military power. It was the Marshall Plan that created trust that this was a country that was special. It's a country that I came to as a graduate student because this was the kind of country I wanted to be a part of. It's why I became an American. It's based on trust, not on power. The trust that the power the countries have is used in a way that is responsible. The trust that allies have in the United States that it still shares its values and will come to their defense if they were attacked. The confidence of adversaries that the United States will in fact act to defend its interests. The trust of trading partners, that their goods and services will be treated fairly when they enter the American market. The trust in U.S. finances, that have made the dollar the world's reserve currency and its treasuries and equities the final safe haven around the globe. And the trust that U.S. products and services will indeed work as advertised, from pharmaceuticals to computer chips to weapon systems. All of that trust is now broken. That trust was the foundation of the Pax Americana, was the foundation of the world America made, and it is gone. And if anyone who's ever been in a situation, whether it's a marriage or a family or any other business relationship, and have been in a situation where trust has been broken, you know how hard it is to restore it in the future. Instead of hoping that the United States will come back, countries around the world no longer trust America, and they are therefore now reducing their dependence on the United States, looking elsewhere, at great cost not only to America and Americans, but frankly, to world stability and the globe itself. Allies are now trying to figure out how they can work together on European defense, but also working together with Asian allies. Adversaries are filling the vacuum that is being left by the United States retreating from the world. China has now more diplomats in more diplomatic missions around the world than the United States does. Its diplomats are dominating in the international organizations of the United Nations. It is exploiting the absence of the United States in Africa and in Latin America. Trading partners are reducing their dependence on the United States. China is looking elsewhere for oil, for grains, and indeed for consumer good markets. The European Union has just concluded a major agreement with Mercosur to have a free trading agreement between Europe and South America. Canada, Japan, and the European Union are finding ways in order to reduce their dependence on the United States. And the European Union and the Asian countries are trying to figure out how they can create a trading system that would be not open, not only not to China, but also not to the United States. So in other words, what we have seen in these past few months is what I would call an unprecedented act of great power suicide. Never before has a great power done so much, so fast, to undermine its own power. That's not only a tragedy for the world, it is a tragedy for America. Because America and the world have been safer, richer, and freer because the United States has employed its power ever since the day Japan forced the United States to enter Second World War. Its power in a way that not only benefited the United States, but also other countries, and thereby themselves. So, the Pax Americana is dead, and it won't be restored, and it won't come back. It's impossible to know what will come back, what the world, in fact, will look like at the end of Trump's presidency. Whenever that end will finally come, though I predict come it will. If I had told you on January 20, 2025 that in less than 6 months the world would look like the world does today, you wouldn't have believed it. So it's hard for me to tell you what the world will look like once Trump is gone. But I do know this. At the end of his presidency, America will be weaker, poorer, less free, and less trusted than at the beginning of his presidency. And meanwhile, the rest of the world moves on. The greatest fallacy of Donald Trump in thinking about the world is he thinks other countries have no agency. They do. They have choices. He may want to set the price in his beautiful shop, but other countries may decide not to shop at all. So it doesn't matter. The rest of the world is going to move on. Our major adversaries will become more powerful, and their power will become more entrenched in this global system than it was before. And our major friends, hopefully, if they're smart enough, which I think they are, but it's not a guarantee, but hopefully, will also become more powerful and find new ways to cooperate, not only without China, but frankly, without the United States. Now, if we're lucky and we survive the Trump presidency, it's an if, the next president and administration will hopefully recommit to these foundational principles that have served America so well for the past 80 years. But unlike in 1945, in 2029, or whenever the day comes, we will neither have earned the trust in the way we did because of what we did in World War II, nor have the power to exert the leadership that we have ever since. At best, we will be able to recommit to our allies, not as first among equals, but just as one of equals, and hopefully contribute to a world that is more secure and prosperous and free, at least for those countries. But the age in which Washington's word was king, the age where when, like E.F. Hutton, when Washington spoke, people listened, that age is gone forever and won't return. Thank you very much. Yeah, I was very optimistic. I told you need alcohol.
I'm told we're going to get some water and a table, but let me start first by thanking you for that presentation. We need to be told like it is. We've been told too many things that we're not quite sure about. I want to go back, you mentioned the concept of soft power. The first seminar we held in 2023 was given by Joe Nye, who sadly recently died, who really coined the concept of soft power, which is the ability to co-opt rather than coerce, in contrast to hard power. It involves shaping the preferences of others through appeal and attraction. It's non-coercive, using culture, political values, and foreign policy to exact change. I think you've said we don't have much of it left, but can we get any of it back?
So it turns out you can't buy houses with soft power, and you can't develop commercial real estate with soft power, which is why the President of the United States doesn't understand or know what soft power is. But anyone who's ever studied power, leadership, how to get stuff done, innately knows what soft power is. You are much better off to convince someone to do something they would otherwise not do if they believe it's in their interest to do so, than they do it out of fear or out of a transactional relationship in which one side wins and the other side loses. So every country has soft power, and every country tries to use power in a way that mixes some kind of leverage that you may have because of the resources that you possess and the attractiveness of the ideas that you're trying to get them to do. However, the United States was unique because it had a unique role. At the core of the Pax Americana was the idea the United States would expend resources over and above what it would expend just to maintain its own immediate interest. Because by creating a global system in which rules and regulations and norms were accepted as the right way to go about, you would likely eliminate the scourge of war, at least among great powers and among your friends, and create conditions for greater prosperity and greater freedom. That was the Franklin Roosevelt, Harry Truman, Dean Acheson, Henry Morgenthau insight of the time that was transformative for American policy. It is now ingrained in who we are. But the willingness and ability to do that within the research that you had meant that you can't just force people to do this. You have to find other ways to attract them. And we're not spending $37 billion on foreign aid, which, by the way, is a pittance, because then countries will buy our products. No, we're spending it because we create goodwill by doing so. A bag of grain or rice brought to you by USAID enhances the attractiveness of the United States in the people who consume that rice. I was in Rwanda about 5 years ago, driving around the countryside, and everywhere it said, "Your cellular system brought to you by China Telecom." That's soft power. You can talk on your phone, find the weather forecast to decide whether and how you need to deal with your agricultural issue because of China Telecom. Every country uses soft power. But we are losing it, have lost it, a lot of it. We will find that 1 million people are going to die of AIDS and HIV because we have cut back on the crucial provision of HIV aid and medicines. Those 1 million people have families. Those families are going to grow up hating the United States. Is that power or is that dumb?
Well, there have been a number of questions which I'll try to combine about NATO, where you spent a bit of time.
Yep.
In addition to say, what was it like to be the U.S. ambassador to NATO?
Coolest job in the world.
Tell us about what effect you think the U.S., not demand, but hope that European and other NATO countries will increase their commitment, financial commitment, will have.
So first, my wife and I were on opposite sides of the 2008 Democratic election. I imagine that happened in a lot of families. I was a very early Obama supporter. My wife, who had worked for Hillary Clinton in the White House, was a very strong Hillary Clinton supporter. Our kids thought that there were times when we were going to be heading for divorce. We had strong disagreements. And when Obama won, not only the Democratic nomination, but the presidency, he had asked me to be part of his team to do the transition at the National Security Council, and I did. And one of the things when you're in a transition is you can create newer jobs, and I created a job for myself in the White House. And my wife was not, she said, not only did I have to support this dang guy who's not, he has no experience, and Hillary Clinton would have been so much better, but now you're going to be working 7 days a week, 24/7. And we're never going to see you. What good is this? We might as well move on. So when I got a call from Obama's staff saying he would like you to go to NATO, I called my wife and I said, they've offered me the U.S. ambassadorship to NATO. And she said, isn't that like Truman Hall? And I said, yeah, it's Truman Hall. So Truman Hall is one of the 13 most amazing residences of ambassadors that the United States has. One of my good friends at the time was the ambassador to, what later on became the ambassador to the Court of St. James, which has a wonderful residence in the middle of Regent Park, Winfield House, and he would say, I have 13 acres. I said, I have 28. So being at NATO was an amazing job, and being at NATO, not only, and by the way, we're really happily married, and part of that, it's an incredibly incredible place to be. What I learned about NATO, not only being there, but as a student of NATO, which I wrote both my master's and doctoral dissertation on NATO, is that American leadership is really key. That we had, over time, in fact, had created a system in which if we weren't there, the system wouldn't work. And we did that very deliberately to maintain control. So all the major military commands are headed by American leaders who are dual-hatted as both American military and NATO military. So the head of EUCOM, the European Command, is also the Supreme Allied Commander of Europe at NATO. He wears two hats. He has two different offices, but he has one set of airplanes, and the U.S. pays for that. But as a result, we control this organization. And I think one of the things that happened is in our unwillingness to let go, the Europeans over time said, you know what? You can just do it all. You want to control it? Fine. Then maybe we don't have to spend so much money on defense. And particularly after the end of the Cold War, when threat perception had significantly changed, the European spending on defense went through the floor. It was at 2% in 2000. It was at 1.3% by 2014, of GDP. That is not a lot of money for defense, particularly if you pay for pensions and all the other things. And so what Trump has done is he's found a way to create an incentive for the Europeans not only to spend more, but to take more responsibility. The problem is he's done it by creating doubts about the United States. I mean, the reason the Europeans agreed to spend 3.5%, 5% of GDP, 3.5% really on defense and 1.5% on defense-related investments, which they would have done anyway, is not just because they fear Vladimir Putin, which they do. And the closer you are to the Russian border, the more fear you have. But the real reason is they worry about the United States. And so the difficulty that we had, that I had, and frankly every president and NATO ambassador, was how do you convince the Europeans to do more when you weren't willing to cede control? And he said, okay, you know what? I won't even cede control. I'll give it all to you. You take care of it. And so they're spending more. I would have liked to have done it in a more transitional way, but it is effective. The result, however, is that 3.5 years, 4 years, 5 years, 6 years from now, they're less dependent on us than they are now, which means we have less capacity to control. And let's think what that means. We can debate whether the strikes against the Iranian nuclear program were right or wrong. Happy to debate it. We cannot debate that they were incredibly effective in terms of the military capability that was demonstrated. But without NATO, they would have never been able to happen. Why? We needed 45 tanker refuelers to refuel the B-2 bombers and their escorts in order to fly from Missouri all the way to Iran and back. Where do you think those tankers are based? If they're in the United States, they're not going to get there. They're all in Europe. So having a presence in Europe gives us a real military capacity in the Middle East. Same is true with regard to Japan and South Korea. That's why you have allies. Not just because you're nice, which we are most of the time, but because they have land and capabilities, and they buy stuff, like lots of stuff. That's why you have allies. And you then have to make the calculation, how much do you want to piss them off? Is that good English? It's French. By the way, it's a dual language in NATO, French and English. So I use a lot of French when I was there. How much do you want to piss them off in order to get them to do what you want them to do versus how much control are you going to cede? And that's the situation we face now. So like everything, it's complicated.
And one of the issues that may get countries rather pissed off, and there were a number of questions about it, are tariffs.
Yes.
And they make statesmanship, as one of the questions said, more complicated regarding foreign relationships. And how much damage do you think is occurring from the way in which tariffs are being imposed, brought back, put on again a new batch in today's paper. And what do you think will recover from that?
So I'm not an economist. I don't even pretend to be one. So I don't really know what the long-term consequences of this effort to remake the global economy and bring it back to the 1890s. When we had a great president, and we were in fact richer from 1870 to 1913, according to President Trump, than we have ever been in our lives. Which is news to 320 million more Americans that now exist and did at the time. But anyway, I don't know what the economic consequences are. I worry significantly that the combination of tariffs and the combination of the recent, whatever it's called, triple B bill, a big beautiful bill, will create a financial situation in which treasuries and other investment instruments are no longer seen as a safe haven, that the Europeans and others are going to find ways to strengthen their ability to build capital markets in Europe, to use the euro as a competing reserve currency with the United States, all of which, by the way, are manifestations of our power that is part of our Pax Americana, never exist, and that is frittered away. What I worry about more is that if Donald Trump believes one thing with absolute conviction, it's that tariffs are a good thing. And you can go back to the 1980s, and he was arguing. His famous interview in Playboy magazine in 1991 was a major case for tariffs. He argued in an ad in the New York Times, Washington Post, and the Boston Globe on September 2nd, 1987. I know the date. I read the ad. It's in the book. That tariffs were an extraordinarily important tool for us to get what we want. And so I worry that the markets, mainstream economists, many of our allies have misinterpreted what he is about when it comes to tariffs. They all think he's using this as a negotiating tactic, that he's a deal maker. And indeed, he is a deal maker. That's what he says himself. But he's also tariff man. And he wants tariffs for three fundamental reasons. Number one, he believes the tariffs are a source of income. And they are, because you get money. And the more tariffs, the higher your tariffs is and the more your income, the less you have to tax people. And indeed, it's true that when McKinley was president, we ran our government on the basis of tariff revenue, not income taxes. Forget why it was we got income taxes, but that's perhaps another story. So we're going to have a baseline tariff regime for everyone. It could be 10%, increasingly it looks like it, maybe 20%, which, by the way, is what he said during the campaign. The second thing he believes in tariffs is he believes that other countries have stolen our jobs, and he wants them back. And he wants them back in cars, steel, aluminum, copper, and pretty soon, pharmaceuticals, semiconductors, lumber, believe it or not. And so the whole series of decisions under the legislation that Congress allows him to examine whether there's a national security reason for imposing tariffs, he will impose those tariffs. And he's already done it with cars. They're at 25%. Steel, they're at 50%. And he thinks that therefore people are going to invest in the United States. The third is he has this really weird idea that bilateral trade deficits matter from an economic or any other, and so part of the negotiation is to try to get those trade deficits settled. That's what he believes. And I think the result is, as I mentioned in my talk, countries are going to de-risk from the United States. They're going to reduce their dependence on the United States. They're not going to invest here in great numbers. They're going to do less with the United States, which will make us poorer. perhaps other countries stronger. When Mexico decides that it needs a trading relationship with Brazil, watch out. When the Prime Minister of Canada creates a new department for inter-province trade agreements, so he can start thinking about trading and economic relations east-west rather than north-south, watch out. When the European Union suggests that they have an agreement with the CPTPP countries, the countries that used to be part of the Trans-Pacific Partnership that Trump walked away from in 2017, in order to set new rules for trade. You're now talking about over 50% of the global economy. And those rules are going to be set without the United States having a seat at the table. And so I worry, and I said this before, I worry that Trump doesn't understand that other people have choices. And they can choose not to play his game, not to make deals. When he said to Time magazine that I owned a shop, you know, the United States is like a department store. I owned a shop and I set the prices for you to be able to shop. They may decide to shop elsewhere. They may decide to not shop at all. There is a reason why Trump went bankrupt 6 times. He's a lousy, lousy negotiator because he overthinks and he thinks that leverage is all that he needs, and he doesn't remember that people, they don't want, I'm not going to buy your house, I'm going to buy something else. As one person who once did a deal with him told me, he said, there's not a single person in the world who's done more than one deal with Donald Trump. Except the American people.
Which brings up a question which was asked and got a couple of votes at least. What do you wish every citizen in the USA knew about global affairs? Not Trump, but global affairs. But you doubt that they currently understand.
So it's basically what I tried to point out in the first 20 minutes of the talk. What Americans need to understand is while we are a really big, powerful country, we are big and powerful because we are engaged in the world. We would not be big and we would not be powerful if we retreated from the world. Our security depends on the security of others. If others are insecure, we are insecure. Our prosperity depends on the prosperity of others. If they're not prosperous, we can't be prosperous. And the same idea that led a federal system to understand that you needed to have a federal decisions on commerce when it came to the relationship between states. That you had one currency, you had one set of rules for moving goods and services across states. That same fundamental philosophy works in the global system as well. So it's the interconnectedness, the interdependence that we have in the world that we live in. And how you behave abroad will determine how others behave towards you. Simple. I think it's in the Bible. But it is an insight that most Americans don't agree with or don't understand in their core. They think that foreign relations and the world is over there and we're over here and we have nothing to do with each other. They think that wars are stupid. Why don't, and the president, by the way, says that all the time. He talks about Ukraine and Russia in the same way he talked about Iran and Israel as little kids fighting in a park. Vladimir Putin is not a little kid fighting in a park. He just wants Ukraine. That's fundamentally what it is about. There's politics. There's other ideas in it. It's more complicated. So I think the most important thing people need to understand about global affairs is that they're not global. They're local. They're us. We are what we are because what's happening over there. Where were you in 9/11? That happened, some cave in Afghanistan. Turned out it changed our world. Oh, and where were you in March of 2020 when a pandemic hit, which didn't come from the United States? And we could have closed every border. It would have made not a hoot difference. We live in a world that is one world. And oh, those floods that we had in Texas, it came from that Gulf of America, as it's called, that was heating up so much because of the total changes in the climate that have been produced by humankind now over the past 150, 200 years. And so that's the world we live in. So being engaged, understanding it is what Americans need to understand. And we need leaders to help them understand it. Right now, not so much.
You mentioned earlier China and Africa and Rwanda. What's your assessment of the threat that China presents to the U.S., and what should we be doing about it? A lot of students from China study here because it's a good place to learn about things.
So at its core, China is not us. We are not China, and they are not us. But they are us in one particular way. They are a power that is trying to compete for influence around the world. Not because they're communist, although that too. Not because they're Asian, although it'd be hard to have had another power like the United States in our hemisphere, but fundamentally because they're powerful. And when you have two countries that are powerful, they're going to compete with each other. And the Chinese have been doing it far more effectively than we have. You've been reading about critical materials lately? Rare earths and rare earth magnets? Probably never heard of that before this month or this year. Sure, I didn't hear until quite recently. The Chinese have been systematically trying to dominate this market for 25 years. Great environmental cost to their country, but they now have it. There's nothing we can do about it. They're in competition with us. I don't think they're evil. I don't think that they want to destroy us. I don't think they're the Soviet Union, which I did think was evil, which I did think wanted to win a competition which it believed it could only do through a global revolution. I don't think the Chinese are there, although if they get the chance, they might. But they are in strategic competition with us. Real, fundamental. Now, in this competition, we have one thing they will never have. Allies. We have 55 allies, at least we used to. Countries with whom we have an agreement to defend their security. 55 countries in the world. China has one. North Korea. The rest, it has a bunch of clients. But as Iran learned last month, having China or Russia or indeed North Korea as one of your buddies doesn't help you very much when you get attacked. That's the difference. And so what I worry about most in the policies that we're pursuing, this great power suicide that I talked about, is we're destroying the one thing that makes us powerful. Friends who would die for us. During the time I was at Nato, in Estonia, from 2004 to 2014, every single person who served in their army served in Afghanistan. By per capita, more Estonians were killed than Americans in Afghanistan. And you asked any Estonian, why are you in Afghanistan? Do you see that the Taliban as a threat? And the answer is no. We're there to be a good friend to the United States, so that when we need the United States, they will be a good friend to us. That's an ally. Fighting and dying for things that they believe we think are important because they want us to be there. So that's what we're throwing away. All the other stuff, technology, all those are details.
Our emissaries abroad, in addition to ambassadors, are people in State Department and other government agencies. But what do you think the long and short-term effects of what is going on with Foreign Service officers, excuse me, both current and the pipeline, what effect will that have for gaining the kind of cooperation you talk about?
This is not just the Foreign Service. It's, other than the U.S. military, which is probably the only institution that is not yet, where the expertise has not really been affected, although even there, of course, have been an incredible purge of top-level military leadership, including the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, because I think he was black, and the CNO of the Navy, because I think she was a woman, both of whom I know well and are extraordinary people. We're destroying the expertise of the U.S. government. That's what we're doing. And anybody who's ever served in government knows that you don't do it for the money. And frankly, you don't do it for the prestige. Because by the time you get to be in a position to have any prestige, you're too old to care. You do it because you believe it's important. You are a meteorologist because you believe that figuring out weather patterns is important, so you can serve your community, whether it's your nation or whatever, to warn them about a storm that may be coming. To just take one example that just comes to mind. You are in a call center so that when somebody calls and needs your help, you pick up the phone and you figure out how to help them. You're not doing it for the money. You're doing it because it's important. And that is gone. That expertise is leaving. Anybody who has an opportunity to go somewhere else is going to go somewhere else. They're leaving. They're leaving universities. Great talent is being poached around the world. I talked to a very good friend of mine who's an ambassador of a very important country here in Washington. He said, I now spend 95% of my time looking for talent to steal because I can offer them a better deal than you can. Who would have thought that you can actually now get Nobel laureates not being in the United States but wanting to go to France, even if they're not French? And so that's what we're doing. And so the Foreign Service, the relationships that they're built over decades. It was a very good piece, I think, in the New York Times, our former USAID person who talked about how it's been 10 years in Kenya. And in those 10 years, it built up relationships that created trust and allowed people to do what they needed to do and to believe in the United States, and it's gone. That's not just shooting yourself in the foot, it's shooting yourself in the head.
Last question.
I told you you need alcohol.
President Trump has made no secret of his wanting to be awarded the Nobel Peace Prize.
If he goes home, he can have it tomorrow.
Just last week, 4 U.S. presidents have won it. Teddy Roosevelt, Wilson, Carter, and Obama. I know predictions are hard. You don't shy away from them. Will he be the fifth? And why do you think yes or no?
No, he will not. Because, there's two fundamental reasons. One is he seems to think that this is a vote by leaders So everybody who comes and says, oh, like Netanyahu did, is I'm awarding you, I want you to be, it's 5 legislators in the Norwegian parliament. They make the decision. I've been to Norway. I love Norway. There's no way you can find 5 people in Norway who would want to give him the Nobel Peace Prize. So that's one thing. The other thing is, he won't actually produce peace. It's like the trade agreements with Vietnam and the UK. They're not worth the paper they're written on, and besides, what's written on the paper is incomprehensible. And he has this idea that peace is the absence of war. Peace is the continuation of war. Just like war is the continuation of peace. That's what Karl von Clausewitz, the great German general, said. War is the continuation of politics by other means. So to get a peace, you need to change the dynamic in the thinking of those who are involved in the war. That, I hate to tell you, but that requires more than Steve Witkoff running around from Russia to Iran to Gaza as if you can do all 3. So he can get a Nobel Peace Prize. We're not going to get a Nobel Peace Prize. At the NATO summit, he still talked about, we solved Kosovo. Really? I mean, last I looked, there's still the same problem in Kosovo as there was when I dealt with Kosovo in the 1980s, 1990s. And so he's just not going to get there. Will the war end in Gaza? It may be, but not because of Donald Trump. It will end when both sides decide it's better not to fight than to fight. And how that you influence that, that's what diplomacy is about. It's not about threatening. It's not, I will call you. I mean, he seems to be pissed off now at Putin because he's called him 6 times and he's still fighting. I mean, it's remarkable. My God, you talk to him on the phone and have a very good conversation, then he starts shooting missiles again. Like, really? You think a phone call is going to end a war that has been going on since 2014? He apparently seems to think so. So, no, he's not going to get a Nobel Peace Prize.
Well, one of the wonderful things that I like about seminars is that speakers both answer many of the questions about a particular topic, like this one this evening, but also give us something to think about as the issues under discussion continue to come up, as these certainly will. You've done both, and for that, thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.